All righty. I'd like to welcome everyone. I think we're going to have a very full meeting today. We have 8 constitutional amendments on the ballot in November that we're going to be talking about. I'm Stephen Procopio. I'm the president of the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana. I'd like to welcome everyone. As I said, we're going to be talking about those constitutional amendments, and we have a wonderful panel to talk about it. In addition to myself, we have Melinda DeLotte, our research director, but we're also very welcome to have Barry Irwin, who is the president of the Council for a Better Louisiana, which I consider a sister organization of PAR. One big difference between us and Cable is that Cable will put out positions on the amendment. So I look forward to talking about that. We also have Jan Moeller, who is the executive director of the Louisiana Budget Project, very similar to PAR and Cable, that they focus on policy and how its effect on low and moderate income families. If Cable and PAR are sisters, then Jan and his group are maybe like our second cousin once removed or something like that. So let me explain the format, which is going to be very full. We have 8 amendments to talk about, and that's not our fault. That's what the legislature gives us. We're not going to be talking about the ones that are coming up in December. You can go to our guide to look at those. I'm going to give a brief 30-second to 60-second explanation of what the amendment is, and then I'm going to turn it over to Melinda, Barry, and Jan to kind of talk about more context. Importantly, this is a little different than other webinars. We're going to try and talk about each question that y'all have about the amendments as we go through them. So get your questions in even earlier than you normally do, particularly if you have a question on amendment number 1 or 2, start putting them in now. Don't wait. I will also try and answer any questions through text. I'll type them in if I can get to them to try and free up a little bit more time. Let's see. And really, that's it. We're going to spend a few minutes per one, and let's go ahead and get started. Y'all ready?
Ready.
All right, let's start with constitutional amendment number 1. An easy one that we can start with. There are 7 funds in the Constitution that this affects. Right now, those funds can essentially invest up to 35% of their stocks of their investments in stocks. This would move it up to 65%. The 2 biggest funds that this affects are the Millennium Trust Fund, which most of that money tends to go into TOPS, also healthcare and some other things. And there's also the LAQTF, or the Louisiana Education Quality Trust Fund. Those are each about $1.5 billion. And then there are 5 others. So essentially increases the amount that can go to stocks. So with that.
Okay, well, Barry, I guess I'm going to start with you on this one, since Cable has taken a position in support of this amendment. Can you walk us through why y'all are supporting it, and what do you think are the positive aspects of this amendment?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. Number one, we can just look at the financial situation that our investments have been in over the years. And now is not the right moment to be thinking about this. Probably if you're looking at the stock market, thinking whatever, these are very long-term investments. We need to think about them in the long term. The investments that we have been getting off of those things through these very short-term types of things have not yielded the benefits and the returns that we have seen in the past. In fact, if you go back 10 years or more, we're getting, almost half of what we were getting in terms of revenues off of those things, and they go to a lot of good things. So that's reason number 1. But the other reason I think it's important is because the money that's been coming into them in the past are from diminishing sources of revenue. Tobacco settlement money, offshore oil money, they have their ups and downs, but they're basically on a downward thing. So for the future, what we're going to have to rely on for the revenues out of these funds is the investment income, the earnings out of it. And if we don't have some more robust ability to generate earnings, we're not going to see the returns that we should off of these billions of dollars.
Okay, and Jan, I'm assuming a lot of people right now would be a little iffy about wanting to invest anything else in the stock market, considering where things seem to be going these days. So can you talk about what might be some opposition to this, and if the Budget Project has taken a position of any kind?
So thanks. First of all, the Budget Project does not have a position on this amendment. We have a guide. We're a little slower off the bell than PAR and Cable. Our guide to these amendments is being published on Monday. Barry's right, of course. And I think with any investments in the stock market, there's a potential for greater returns than you get with more conservative investments. But there's also greater risk that comes with it. The stock market goes up, the stock market goes down, and depending on when you need to tap these funds, one of these funds is the Nursing Home Trust Fund, for example. Melinda and I can remember when that fund had $1 billion in it, when you really needed that money. So you never know how long these funds are going to be around. The other question, and this is really for voters to think about, is, how much power do you want to invest with the state treasurer to make these stock market decisions and investments? There was recently in the news that the treasurer decided to divest, $800 million from an investment fund because he didn't like their investment strategy. So we don't know exactly which stocks these would be invested in. Presumably it'd be a prudent strategy. But that's a question for voters to decide if they really want to vest this authority with the treasurer and how much risk tolerance they have. The same questions we ask ourselves when we decide on our 401ks.
Right. Okay, Stephen, take it away. Let's go to number 2. You're muted.
All right, I didn't want to jump in on y'all. All right, let's go to number 2. And one thing I want to point out is that we also put our guide to the amendments in the link in the chat. And we also put Barry's guide as well. And if Jan had gotten it done in time, we would put his in there as well. We're happy to share. So amendment number 2, this is one of several property tax amendments that we have. And to point out, everything basically with property tax has to be done through a constitutional amendment. That's why you see so many of these. Most people are familiar with the homestead exemption. It's a $75,000 exemption on your assessment that you don't have to pay taxes on. For disabled veterans, they actually get a higher homestead exemption, and that's in this table right here. So if you have 100% disability or 100% unemployability, then you can actually get, instead of a $75,000, you can get a $100,000 exemption. The proposal is to increase that to a total exemption for those who are 100% disabled, and then allow those that have on a sliding scale of disability to have some sort of additional exemption above and beyond what the homestead calls for.
Okay, and since Cable has not taken a position on this one, we're just going to start with Jan to talk through maybe the pros and cons of this amendment.
I think the pros on this amendment obviously is that nobody I know is against benefits for disabled veterans. There's probably nobody more sympathetic. We all owe a debt of gratitude to people who served this country and got injured in the service of their country. But if I'm going to play devil's advocate on this, Louisiana has very low property taxes, residential property taxes, when you measure us against other states. And it's the main reason that we have really some of the highest local sales taxes of any state. That's what makes our sales tax very high in Louisiana, is because we are so low on property tax and local governments don't have a lot of other options. So anytime you take more property taxes off the table, you risk losing revenue that supports parks and police and other public services, public schools, and so forth. And you put more pressure on local governments to raise the sales tax. So again, the budget project does not have a position on this, but there's certainly two sides to this.
Right. And Barry, can you talk a little bit about why Cable decided not to take a position on this one? Do y'all not normally wade into some of these property tax debates, or was there a particular reason on this one?
We do weigh in on them. I'll tell you really the history on it. I think we have the concerns that Jan mentioned about the erosion of this property tax base, and we've been seeing it year after year. We see an amendment almost every year to do something for different groups of people. The situation, of course, is we certainly are supportive of veterans and people with disabilities. We're hugely supportive of that. On the other hand, this continual erosion, it seems like it's a nibble here and there, but over time, it really does add up. And one of the things that our group, and of course, PAR is trying to do too, is try and maybe rethink that state and local governmental relationship when it comes to revenues and fiscal issues. And the more we sort of erode that base, the more difficult it is to try and get the local governments weaned off of the resources of the state. So we don't take a position because we obviously feel strongly about the veterans in our state and the disabled veterans in particular. Yet, we need to kind of put the brakes on some of these exemptions that we keep passing year after year.
Okay. Amendment 3, Stephen.
All right, this is one of two non-fiscal amendments. You see, this is about civil service employees. Right now, civil service employees cannot, essentially, they're supposed to be non-political. They cannot do any campaigning. This would change it so that they could actually support their family members. Now, so who is affected? It's about 51,000 civil servants. It would affect all of them except for civil servants who are with registrars of voters, employees, and people in the Secretary of State's office who are in the elections division. It would also affect family members, but there's kind of a broad list of what a family member is. And this, we stole this from cable, but we gave you credit. So there's a lot of members that are actually affected when you say a family. And then in addition, though, it would allow them to take photos or be in campaign ads or do events, but it wouldn't allow them to make donations or to solicit donations. So it doesn't affect everybody, and it doesn't allow them to do everything, but it would be some additional people that wouldn't have civil service protection in this particular area.
Okay, and I know that the cable has taken a position of opposition to this one. So Barry, can you walk us through that decision?
Yeah, we just think this is a door that's been closed for a long time, and we don't need to open it. I think a lot of it certainly goes back to our history, if you want to go back to Huey Long and all that. But these things were put into the Constitution for protections of civil service employees. This amendment came forward because politicians want to have the family members who are the civil service employees in their campaigns. It didn't come from the civil service people who oppose it or the employees of the state. It came from the politicians. I think the fact that there is an exception for Secretary of State employees in the elections division and the registrars suggests that if we're going to keep those folks from out of it, it's probably smart to keep the rest of the folks out of it too. I think it's a protection that really came from the politicians, and I think we need to really think really hard about, opening that door.
And now, I think that the argument, just to play devil's advocate here, the argument that has been made in support of it is that, shouldn't family members, just because they're a police officer or firefighter, shouldn't they get to be in a family photo with their, with their father or their mother who's running, or their, uncle who's running? Shouldn't they be allowed to actually help out somebody they're obviously going to be supporting 9 times out of 10 anyway? Jan, is that a persuasive argument to you?
We don't have a public position on this, but I think I share the heartburn that Barry described for the reasons that he described. I think, and he's absolutely right. This didn't come from the civil servants themselves who are clamoring to be in campaign ads. 3 of us on this call were political reporters at one point in our lives, and when you do that, you sort of understand that there are certain trade-offs that come with that, and that you have to sort of keep your partisan opinions and political opinions to yourselves, and there's a firewall there. I think the same applies to civil servants for very good reasons. We expect them to sort of be above and outside partisan politics, and this isn't the end of the world if it passes, but I think it starts to erode those divisions, that separation that we've had for good reasons going back, more than 80 years.
Okay. And just a reminder, if anybody has any questions, we've gotten 1 question so far. So if you have any questions about any of these amendments, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section or the chat, please. And with that, Stephen, let's go to number 4. Moving along.
All right, number 4, it's a fiscal amendment, but relatively easier to understand than the other ones. It would allow local governments to waive water charges that are not the result of anything that the customer did. And the reason why we have this, there's a clause in the Constitution that says governments cannot donate. You can't give money away, which we generally think is a good idea. But that clause also then generates a number of exceptions, and this would be one of those exceptions. The idea is that if there was a cost that a customer can have, essentially hitting damage to their water lines that they have to fix, but it's not their responsibility, can the local governments waive that fine? And it wouldn't, and to be clear, it wouldn't mandate that they do it. It would give them the ability to do that.
Jan, this is something that clearly grew out of disaster issues in terms of damage that storms and flooding have done to some water lines. That's clearly where this emanates from. Can you talk about the pros and cons of this one?
Well, I'm going to talk about the pros first. I think Barry might talk about the cons.
Yeah, Barry has very opposed.
This seems like common sense to me, frankly, because we are talking about something that, again, isn't the customer's fault, and we know that water bills, if water main breaks or something happens during a disaster, and you get stuck with maybe you're paying $60 a month, and all of a sudden it's $500. That can be a huge imposition on somebody. And it just is common sense that if it's not the customer's fault, that they should have the ability to get some redress for that. And so I understand why the constitutional language is there, but when, I don't think they anticipated every outgrowth when they put that language in there in 1974, and it makes sense to have an exception.
And I think Barry's going to disagree with you and say none of this is common sense.
Well, I knew I'd get some heat on this one anyway, but I think that the problem is, how do you draw the line about it's not my fault? And I used a couple of examples in our report. One of them is like, what if you're on vacation for a week and the washer hose breaks on your washing machine, and it's a brand new washer hose? That's not your fault. So you've got a big water bill and you don't want to pay it. It seems like it's a little facetious, but I think part of the problem is these local water boards are going to be inundated with these same kinds of requests. Honestly, the flood issue is one thing, but what really prompted this was a legislator who had a constituent that had somebody go through his property with it had a bayou on his property, and they ran into his water line. That's what made him bring it. So, I think we're just going to see an inundation of these things. The last thing I'd say is a lot of these are going to affect rural water companies, which are struggling very badly, as you very well know. The revenues that they need are things that they need to deliver these services. I just think it's going to open up a very slippery slope of being inundated with requests to have their water bills waived. And the last thing I'd say is that the companies or the water systems do have the flexibility to work with customers over a payment plan. So it can be spread over a much longer period of time than that 1 month that might be excessive.
Okay, well, now let's move on to Amendment 5, which I would argue is probably one of the most difficult to explain and understand. And so we apologize to voters in advance for this one. Take it away.
And, we've kind of been going through these kind of quickly, which is fine. I think it's been great. This one, we might have to spend a little bit more on the explanation and working out some of the details, because this is probably the most complicated one. All right, so this would allow local governments to maintain that they can adjust their current authorized millage rate. It does a lot more than that. The ballot language doesn't quite cover it. So to back up a little bit, every 4 years, assessors have to go through and do an assessment of the property in a parish. And then if that raises, and it usually does, the assessed level, then that would bring in more taxes, because the base of how it's getting taxed goes up. And so the millage rate would still apply. And so there would be more taxes coming in. But sort of to deal with an incentive to make sure people aren't just jacking up the assessments to get more tax dollars, the governing body can then essentially roll back. In fact, if they don't do anything, it rolls back. So you might have normally collect this much more because of your assessment, but you'll lower your millage rate, which would bring back how much you're collecting to the same amount. So that is a roll back. Then a roll forward is, well, we don't want to do that. We actually want to collect that money. So you increase the millage rate to what it was anyway, instead of rolling it back. And then you collect that additional amount based on the assessment. So simple enough. That's just the current system. All right, here's the actual new amendment. You can only roll forward a millage under the current law during the next assessment cycle. So essentially you have 4 years to use it or lose it. You either move up or you're stuck at the lower rate. This amendment will allow you that ability to roll forward at any time during the length of the millage. And there's some concerns about using or losing it. I have probably way oversimplified this in terms of what you have to do, but it's a very complicated process of trying to roll back millages so you don't collect extra tax dollars based on the assessment, or rolling forward in case you do want to capture some of those things. And this would essentially give the locals more flexibility on how and when they have to use that ability to roll forward. Okay, Melinda, guys, I probably left out a ton of stuff. So please, we can take our time on this one because I think it deserves a little extra time.
Yeah, I think we have some time on this one. This is the amendment that helped me learn a lot more about the property tax system in this state, if I'm going to be honest. Barry, I believe cable is supporting this one. So can you talk us through why y'all are supporting this one and what you think the benefit would be to people who pay property taxes?
I'm like Stephen, I don't really want to talk about this one. I just usually say, instead of explaining it, you would probably support it if you really understood it. But anyway, what I would say is, it is very complicated. The Constitution, basically wants you to roll back those taxes so you're not having property values inflate or basically increase your taxes through, never fault of your own, whatever you want to call it that. So it has this mechanism to do it, but it allows the local government to keep that same taxing authority at the millage rate, even though it's not levying it at that point. Obviously, local governments want to keep that authority because if they don't, maybe there's an emergency or whatever, they can roll that back up and take care of that emergency or whatever. The problem is, it's like Stephen said, if you don't use it, you lose it. So if you don't use it once every 4 years, you're going to be raising taxes about once every 4 years and then rolling it back again. So it's an up and down thing, just so the local governments can maintain this taxing authority that they don't want to give up. So the bottom line of this is it won't require them to use it or lose it to maintain that taxing authority. So for most voters, I think that the taxpayers, the issue is you won't see this potential roller coaster that you see in certain jurisdictions every 4 years. It's probably going to stay much more the same. It doesn't give the local governments any more authority to do anything. It just gives them some flexibility that they don't have to levy a tax increase, in quotes, unless they need it for an emergency or some specialized circumstance. And I don't know if that makes that any clearer or not, but that's kind of our view.
Well, we actually have a question about this one, which is, do other states, local governments have a similar authority? Do either you, Barry or Jan, know if other states give similar authority to local governments?
I don't know, but I would suggest these things are very localized, and these types of taxes, the way they are administered across the country. So I would think this is probably a fairly unique situation in, around the country.
Jan, you want to jump into this one?
I don't know the answer to that. And like you, Melinda, this amendment was an opportunity to learn a lot about property taxes that I didn't know. I'm not going to try to repeat what I think Stephen and Barry did a very good job explaining what this is about. And I think they're absolutely right that this is really about giving local governments a little bit more time to plan, a little bit more flexibility, instead of feeling the pressure to roll forward their millages every time property assessments go up. Certainly at the Budget Project, I think, we would probably support a scheme that is less reliant on sales tax and more reliant on property taxes to fund local needs. And we would certainly think it's a good idea for local governments to have more flexibility and more ability to plan for their needs.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure other states allow for the roll back and roll forward as a general. I don't know how ubiquitous it is. I know there are other states. I know Delaware does. I think Michigan does. I'm not sure about like our locals like Texas and our neighbors. The question here is, how much time do they have to do that, and when is the timing of it? And I have no idea if we're like others or not.
Yeah, and that's the part I was kind of talking about. I mean, I think you're right about the rollback thing. That's kind of, I think, a philosophical thing that most people agree with, or most states do the same thing. But I don't know about this quirky thing where you have to roll it up within that period or you lose that taxing authority. That seems to me probably to be a little bit more unique to Louisiana. And that's the part we're trying to fix, not trying to kind of roll those taxes back so that they're not collecting more money than they really asked the people for.
And I think some of the arguments during the debate involved, that a lot of local taxing authorities end up doing the roll forward quickly just because they're afraid if they don't, they will lose that authority entirely, even if they don't necessarily need the money at that time. Now, I think
Yeah.
the arguments in opposition obviously have been, they have enough time to figure out if they need this revenue. They can decide they don't need extra time because it just gives them more time to possibly quote unquote raise taxes on people by giving them extra time. And I feel like those are the two competing arguments I've heard about this one.
Yeah, and I sort of feel like it's kind of unrealistic to think that local governments are going to willingly give up taxing authority that voters have given them. That's just not the nature of the beast. So that they exercise that once every 4 years, just so that they maintain that. And I would say that's probably not what taxpayers actually would really want, their local governments to be doing. Probably, I'm guessing.
Okay. Well, we've answered the two questions we got on that one. So I guess let's move on to yet another property tax amendment, Amendment 6.
There's at least this one, even though it's another property tax amendment, is a relatively simpler one. Relatively.
Sort of.
So statewide, there is there is a sort of cap on the amount your property taxes can go up because of an assessment of 50%. So if you go over 50% under the current law, that essentially has to get slowly phased in over time. It is an increase in any 1 year in your tax liability. This amendment, which is for New Orleans only, would have a cap of an increase of 10% in your assessed value. So you can assessed value can only go up by 10%. And if it was over 10%, say it was 100 or it was 30% increase, then you would have to eat that additional 10% in those two more years to completely get it. It is a couple of important facts. It is not for someone that buys a new house. So if you buy a new house, you don't get this trigger, and it's not for improvements to each house. So if you make a big improvement, you add another bedroom or a garage or a mother-in-law suite, something like that, you don't get the protection of this 10% either. The idea behind it is that you are living in your home and circumstances around you increase the property value of your home, not anything that you did. Though there are some additional context specific to New Orleans, but I will let y'all deal with that.
Okay, I'm gonna start with you, Jan. Obviously, this is New Orleans specific, and this is because owning a home in New Orleans is becoming increasingly unaffordable is the argument for this one. So can you talk through a little bit about what might be driving these extreme property tax increases in Orleans Parish and what the pros and cons might be on this one?
Well, like you said, I mean, this applies only to New Orleans, and that's the area of the state where real estate property values have gone up the fastest, including, some long, time, neighborhoods where there are a lot of longtime property owners. Maybe the home has been, in the family for a long time. And so people whose main asset has gone up in value results suddenly in their property tax bills, doubling or going up. And this would sort of cushion the increase. So there are a lot of folks in the kind of New Orleans housing activist community who are very supportive of this amendment because they believe it's going to help people stay in their homes in neighborhoods that might be gentrifying, that are suddenly have a lot of Airbnb and sort of short-term rentals coming in that have driven up values. And so this is to protect the character of the neighborhoods. And again, to keep people in their homes who've been in certain neighborhoods for a long time. The downside, of course, as we've talked about with property taxes, is that this will almost certainly result in less tax revenue for local services in New Orleans, whether you're talking about police or parks or libraries, or just municipal services that people in that city depend on. So those are the kind of the pros and cons. But I know that this is, the folks who work on housing in New Orleans are very supportive of this and are very interested in making sure the rest of the state knows about this, because, as we know in politics, very often it can seem like New Orleans is pitted against the rest of the state. So,
and this is one of those weird quirks where the amendment only affects homeowners in New Orleans, but the entire state has to vote on it, and it only passes if the entire state agrees to pass it. So it's one of those quirky things. Barry, I don't think Cable took a position on this one. Is there anything you want to add on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, from a policy point of view, I guess we were a little bit torn on it. I think if you look at it as what the intent is, as Jan mentioned, it's certainly good of trying to keep housing affordable for the people that need it. But, part of the issue is it doesn't just affect low to moderate income families, which are the target. It really affects the whole entire parish and other neighborhoods and other people who, are going to benefit quite a bit from the values that have gone up in their houses. So we've got really a target group of folks that we're trying to protect, but it's really going, to impact everybody. And I think there's some question to me on a policy thing, whether it might not be better to try something else where if those revenues are coming in, you can put together some policy that becomes more on a needs-based thing to target those folks that need it, as opposed to just every property owner or residential property owner with a homestead exemption. And the other thing I would say is, this doesn't affect renters. I mean, renters are paying all of these prices too. It's coming through their rent because commercial properties don't have a homestead exemption or any of these things. And so this wouldn't affect them. So as those property values go up, it's not going to help them stay in their place wherever they are. So I think from a policy point of view, we have, some issues as to whether this is the best policy to direct that. The flip side of that is it's a New Orleans issue, and the New Orleans people can't make a decision on that unless the people at the state level say, we're giving you permission to do this. So, that's why we're a little bit torn on it. We do think that these kind of tax issues should be able to be made at the local level, but our Constitution doesn't really allow that for the most part, or really at all, in terms of property taxes. So it's kind of the yin and yang of it. We don't think it's necessarily the best policy, though it's well intended, but we kind of feel like people in New Orleans, have the right to decide how they want to have their tax policy work.
Right. Okay. Well, let's move on to constitutional amendment number 7. That one has generated a little controversy. So Stephen will walk us through. Wait, I think actually, hang on, before we move on, I feel like we might have just gotten a question. We did just get a question on Amendment 6, which is why should citizens in New Orleans be dependent on voters outside of New Orleans? Essentially, this is a person from North Louisiana saying, as a North Louisiana voter, I don't want anyone from New Orleans voting on anything that affects the local level. I think the answer to that is purely because the way we've set up our property tax structure, it is in the Constitution. So if we want to give a special property tax exemption or change how taxes are charged in Orleans Parish, unfortunately, the entire state has to vote on it in order to make that change. So it's not something that the legislature is meddling in to get everybody to vote on it. It's just one of those things that in order to change the Constitution to allow this, you have to get everybody statewide to vote on it. So
yeah, I mean, because of the property tax, the way anything you need to do with property taxes has to go through the constitutional amendment. And some of that is there as a protection so that you don't just change it in law, which allows the state legislature to do whatever they want with local property taxes. So in a way, it's an extra protection, but yeah, absolutely, it's an issue and it doesn't give the locals a lot of control. Jan?
No, I think that's exactly right. It's in the Constitution, so to change it, you have to go the constitutional route. And I agree that it doesn't always make a lot of sense. And there seems to be, every couple of years we have something that we vote on that's strictly for New Orleans. But as they call it, the Isle of Orleans. But yeah, I don't know if there's that much we can do about it, especially when it comes to property taxes.
right. Okay, let's move on to Amendment 7.
All right, this one is interesting, not necessarily complex, but there's a lot of nuance with this one. Just to start, to let everyone know, the author of this amendment now opposes it. Its general purpose is essentially to change some of the language and prohibit the use of involuntary servitude, except as it applies to the otherwise lawful administration of criminal justice. I read that. This is probably the more important slide. I just put this one together so that we could see this. You have basically what the amendment is. This is the language. For y'all that don't read bills, anything that's a strike through is changing the current language and eliminating it. Anything that's an underline is adding language. So here's the language. It read, slavery and voluntary servitude are prohibited, except in the latter cases, punishment for crime. It very much follows the 13th Amendment of the US Constitution. It struck that out and then added a sort of another paragraph that said, subparagraph 1, does not apply to the otherwise lawful administration of criminal justice. So you have sort of two big changes, or two changes. Whether or not they're big or not is up to interpretation. You're switching out the sort of exemption as punishment for a crime to just be the administration of criminal justice, or the lawful administration of criminal justice. So there's a discussion about what are the differences there. And then it also has, it got rid of the, in the latter case, as punishment for a crime. And so I'm going to let the people in discussion talk about that. Because I think there's a lot of, there's no clear, ruling for this. We're gonna have to figure out what it means, but if y'all can talk about it. Also, I want to point out, even though the author now opposes it, there are still other groups and stakeholders, both nationally and local, that still support this amendment. So I think that this is definitely something we probably need to spend a little bit of time on this one. And we already had, I think, one question on it anyway.
We did indeed. We had a question on this one, but just as we got started, so this is clearly of interest to people. It seems as though there are like obvious competing legal interpretations of whether or not this expands the allowance of involuntary servitude and perhaps the use of slavery in the lawful administration of criminal justice, or if it does anything at all. So Barry, I know Cable is in opposition to this amendment. Is that purely because the sponsor of the amendment is now opposed to it, or is there something more going on there?
No, I think that's the main reason. I mean, I think we certainly support what people were trying to do and what they're trying to do. And we've seen it in other states around the country. And in fact, we're one of 5 states that have similar type things on the ballot this year. Is to try and remove some of the vestiges of slavery and that era that may still be around in our constitutions. And the bottom line, I think, is it was discussed in the committee, for a lot of folks, slavery and involuntary servitude are the same thing. They are synonymous, especially when you go back historically. And so what we had in our Constitution was basically a prohibition against slavery, but you could have involuntary servitude, if you were in jail, whatever the deal is. And I think the language was to try and say, we really are against both of those things, but we don't want to say that we can't have inmate labor. This language was put on in committee because some people found out, looked around on the internet during the committee and found some other language that was used in Utah that voters passed there to try and accomplish the same thing. And everybody said, yeah, okay, that's fine. Let's go with that. Well, they started looking at it more closely and realized it probably isn't exactly the language that they want to use to accomplish that. And you could argue that you're going from saying that slavery is prohibited, but there is involuntary servitude, which is in our current, to saying both of them are kind of okay in limited circumstances. And that was not the intent of really anybody there. So I think the confusion just says that we need to go back to the drawing board and get this right.
And the sponsor of the amendment, Representative Edmund Jordan, has said if it does fail, he, as he hopes it will, that he intends to reintroduce different language that sort of gets more at the heart of what he was trying to accomplish in the upcoming legislative session. Jan, can you talk through sort of what you're hearing in the various advocacy communities that you were engaged in?
Yeah, I think this is a tough one because I think nobody doubts the sincerity or the intent of Representative Jordan with this amendment, and it's exactly what Barry described. We want to get rid of these vestiges of a racist past and kind of create a clean slate. But we still want to allow, I think, for inmate labor, work release programs, things that we have on the books. And this was an attempt to do that. And I don't want to substitute my judgment for those of lawyers because I'm not a lawyer. I think we can safely say that this isn't really going to change anything, whether it passes or fails. It's symbolic in nature. And I think that's where the real question comes in, because I know that there's a lot of concern among groups that work on civil rights and racial justice that if this were to fail, that it would send a message to the country that Louisiana is endorsing slavery. And so I can't say how it will be interpreted. I can't say what the headlines would be on November 9th, but that is certainly a concern. So there are a lot of folks in the civil rights and kind of racial justice side of the political debate who are still very much in favor of this because they worry about the symbolic effect of this amendment being voted down, and they may not have faith in the legislature to go back next year and get this right.
And the language, are you at all familiar with the ballot language in the other states that Barry was referencing? Is it is it as complicated as the language here in terms of the mixed interpretations, or is it a simpler debate in some of these other states?
I don't know what, I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I don't know what happened in Utah, but I would wager that Utah has a less complicated history with slavery and, convict leasing and Reconstruction than Louisiana. So again, I think that this is really about the message that Louisiana voters send to the rest of the country with regards to this issue, to the extent that folks will pay attention to it.
Yeah, Melinda, Tennessee has got something similar on the ballot this year too. And let me just read theirs really quickly. Slavery and involuntary servitude are forever prohibited. Nothing in this section shall prohibit an inmate from working when the inmate has been duly convicted of a crime. That seems to me a very clean way of saying we are against these things. We stand against it forever, but we're not trying to change up the criminal justice system. And language like that seems to me to be more appropriate for what we're trying to say than kind of the convoluted language that we have in there now, it seems to me.
Okay, thank you for that. Stephen, let's move on to the last one. Amendment 8. This is a heavy lift for voters this time of year. So
Yes, all right. So last amendment. This one, again, relative to the other property tax ones, not too difficult. There's a general concept of a freeze. And so this would, there is a way you can get your assessment frozen. It applies to a couple of different groups, those over 65 and those that are totally disabled are two of the major groups. So they have an so it freezes their assessed value of their home. And the idea there's the people on limited incomes or fixed incomes, they don't have to pay increasing taxes because of inflation because their wages don't go up with inflation. That's sort of the idea behind the current issue. And so you have to be one of those groups and you have to make less than $100,000 and that will go up with inflation over time. But right now you have to have less than $100,000. You have to certify that you make less than $100,000. Currently, those over 65 who qualify for that reason don't have to keep recertifying. However, those who are totally disabled and they're in that group do have to annually recertify. And this would essentially change that. So then those that are totally disabled would have to keep recertifying their income. So additional context and details I think are important. So I want to make sure we cover that in the discussion.
okay, and Barry, it seems as though cable is in opposition to this one. Can you talk about why y'all are so surly this go round, or
Yeah.
what's going on with this one?
No, I know on face value, this really doesn't look very well, but Stephen's right. I mean, I think there is some context. First of all, I would say that we opposed the amendment in the past that allowed people who were 65 or older to not have to recertify. For us, it's a couple of things. One is just about accountability. We are giving a valuable tax break to a limited group of taxpayers, and all we're asking for them is to certify that their incomes have not gone up beyond the amount that is required. That's not a difficult thing to do. And I think when it comes to people with disabilities, people say, oh, well, you're picking on a group of folks. Honestly, I don't think we are. I think it's really the opposite. I mean, I come from a family that has worked in the disability community, and a lot of what the message out of the disability community is that we want to be independent. We have independence. We're not, some group of folks that are just totally reliant on whatever. And so I think it's not a difficult thing to recertify this. We really think everybody should have to recertify this. But it also implies that a person's spouse is not there, is not able to do it. It implies that a person, is not able to make a good salary because they have a disability. I think it's just, while it seems like a very feel-good measure in many ways, I think in terms of accountability and just the independence of folks in the disability committee, it's not a high bar to lift.
Jan, are y'all going to be taking any position on this one?
We're not taking a position on this, but I do, generally agree with Barry's analysis. It's not a very high bar to recertify your income. It does happen, maybe not often, that people's incomes, even if you're disabled, changes from year to year. And again, we have, local governments around this state are strapped for money. There's stories in the paper every day about the problems people have hiring teachers and hiring police officers and paying for basic local services. And those services are funded by sales and property taxes. And so every time we make it harder for local governments to raise money through property taxes, we threaten and jeopardize the ability to provide basic public services that contribute to the quality of life. And I think Barry's exactly right about the dignity and independence of people with disabilities. And again, we're not asking them to jump through any major hoops. It's really about just certifying that you make less than $100,000, or else you pay the same property taxes and abide by the same laws as everybody else. So I don't think it's the end of the world if it passes. But this is, it's the law as it stands seems to make sense. And I don't know if the freeze makes sense. The more groups that we sort of give these special deals to, the more we narrow the property tax base. And if you look at the broader picture, there's a lot of folks who say that, the state has way too much control and local governments need to raise more revenue on their own, and not always kind of be asking the state. And so, but we keep tying their hands when at the same time we're asking them to do that.
And just to be par and to present the other side of this argument, since I think Barry and Jan kind of took the same position, I think supporters of the amendment, make the argument that people who are totally disabled are very unlikely to see enough income to reach these benchmarks, and that it is an unnecessary burden to ask them to constantly recertify year after year. So I think that would be the argument that supporters would make in advocating for the amendment.
Right. When we're not taking position, we're just providing, both sides. Be really clear about that.
Yeah.
Good
I
job.
cannot believe we got through this in 45 minutes, but it looks like we did. So
Yes, I'm shocked that we did. I really want to thank everyone. I want to thank the panelists. Y'all were fantastic. Add a lot of additional context. I really want to thank everyone. It was a great discussion. Again, model of civil behavior and something I think we all appreciate. I want to next month, we're going to have another topic. We're leaning toward doing something on insurance, but we have to still work out the details. I want to let everyone know this whole discussion will be put on YouTube, and we will send out the link. I will put it on social media so everyone will be able to get that. I think I'm guessing a lot of people are probably going to end up coming to this as they try and figure it out. I love that we spent the most time on 5 and 7 because those are the different ones that need a little more discussion. Thanks everyone for participating. We had a lot of people this time. Really great. Thank y'all everyone again, and y'all have a great weekend.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, appreciate it.